Welcome to the Republican Professor. I am your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Saturday, 21 February 2026 years after Jesus, and we're on tariffs today in Claremont Review of Books, spring 2025. I've got the wonderful hard copy that I got in the mail. We're going to take a look at Christopher Caldwell's piece called The Tariff Crisis. But it's called The Tariff Crisis on the front page, but the title is a much better title than that, starting on page 17. It's called Let's Not Do That Again. The subtitle, President Trump's Trade War Could Have Ended Badly. So says Christopher Caldwell in Claremont Review of Books. We're going to do a fair use of this material, make a transformative reading of it, and I want to suggest that you subscribe to Claremont Review of Books. Why? Because we want to thank Claremont Review of Books for making this material available. We want to thank Christopher Caldwell for writing it. We want to support the publication of excellent political phenomenology. That's what we really need. We need people that will go deep with courage, conviction, clarity, boldness, coherence, and a measure of thoroughness. So, in that vein, let's get started. I'm going to share my screen. Feel free to call me Sharon because I'm sharing my screen. I'm going to ClaremontReviewofBooks.com. Now, I have a subscription. I'm not logged in. I want you to see this. You can find the volume here, which is 2025, and we're in the summer volume. Sorry, the spring volume, the one that has William F. Buckley on it. And you can see, if you take a look at the bottom there, Christopher Caldwell, The Tariff Crisis. Scroll down, and then you see it says, let's not do that again. President Trump's trade war could have ended badly. This is a friendly criticism from Republicans to Republicans. It's an internecine dispute, as you're witnessing today. But I've had this on the agenda for quite a long time, so today we're doing it. This is open to the public. I'm not logged in. I want you to see that Claremont Review of Books has given this away to the public for free. All you have to do is go to ClaremontReviewofBooks.com and follow along. And you know what? Come on, guys. Support Claremont Review of Books. Send them a donation. Subscribe. It's not a bad price at all for what you get. It's wonderful. In the first months of 2025, Donald Trump played a game of Russian roulette with the American economy and survived. Wow. That's pretty dramatic, dude. That's pretty dramatic. Although the president had never hidden his enthusiasm for tariffs, the way he went about implementing them on taking office sowed confusion. So starts Christopher Caldwell in Claremont Review of Books. And I'm following along with I read this in the hard copy. This is my hard copy. And by the way, there was a confusion in my order. It doesn't usually happen, but they cleared it up. I called the number. I talked to an American, or either that or I talked to a foreigner with an American accent. I talked to somebody that speaks English and speak English well, understood what I was saying, took care of it immediately. Got the right edition out. They sent me 2 winter editions accidentally, and I didn't get the spring, and I didn't notice it until later, like 6 months later, because I'm a little bit behind sometimes preparing for the podcast. So I didn't get this until I think the fall. And that's when I really drilled down and I was like, holy crap, that's a good article. I should have covered it in the spring. Well, I just want to point out that Claremont Review Books has their crap together and they're worth your support. Okay? That's what I wanted to say. Let's not do that again. Let's continue on this wonderful journey through the swirly, twirly gumdrops of the Claremont Review of Books Spring 2025 before we get to the Lincoln Tunnel. Notice I put a little bit of the movie Elf in there because I'm a fan. Targeting not just geostrategic competitors like China, but also allies like Canada. I think that's how you say it. Canada. And Britain, issuing demands that economists struggle to explain, reversing world-shaping politics from one hour to the next, and doing all of this on doubtful constitutional authority sent markets into a tailspin. Let me share a brief story. In the spring of 2025, I was taken to lunch at a fancy schmancy restaurant from a supporter and longtime Bible study friend, a man named, well, I'm not going to say his name, but he's a prominent manufacturer in Southern California who does a lot of business in China and Mexico and does very important manufacturing. He is the operations officer. He's the chief operations officer for this company. It's a family-run company. He is a Republican. He voted for Trump. And he told me these tariffs are crushing. They're crushingly burdensome to business people, to manufacturers especially. Even to figure out what costs to pass on to clients, customers, and ultimately the consumers was very difficult because of how quickly things changed all the time. And it led to a very confusing time, a very uncertain time, and business people hate uncertainty. Capital hates uncertainty, especially for multi-year projects that are complicated and involve lots of moving parts, very could possibly dangerous given the type of manufacturing he was doing, like national security dangerous. Okay. I and so that's what I became aware before I read this article that there was serious concerns in the Republican and Democrat business community that of this approach to how he was negotiating things. Now, a negotiation is supposed to be an inducement to get what you want, but these tariffs are used as a threat, and it was producing allies with people that we don't want to be allied, and it was creating some marginalization from people we probably do want to be a little bit closer allied with. So this is the Republican perspective here in Christopher Caldwell. I think he does a better job of it than I do, so let's get back to it. What do you say? And just when the president had been enjoying a honeymoon, in the last days of January, that's 2025, a majority of Americans had declared themselves for the first time Trumpians. They were particularly optimistic about his economic plans, but their enthusiasm diminished as the rumble of artillery from the trade war grew louder. By mid-April, fewer than 40% backed the president's policy, and Trump was less popular than he had been at the same point in his first term. After a May meeting, the United States and China have stepped back from the astronomical tariffs that each imposed in the course of the spring. Western capitals and Western capital have calmed, and much of Trump's trade plan is going into effect. But American voters have now experienced a sense of insecurity and arbitrariness that they will not soon forget. For a while, previously unthinkable things became thinkable. Recession, depression, lost savings, a premature end to the second Trump administration. In short, a host of confidence-sapping memories that may yet imperil the president's ability to govern. The next subsection is called the chronology of a crisis. A tariff is a government tax on an import. Although the authority to set tariffs belongs to Congress under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Trump claims a 1977 law gives him the prerogative in emergencies. At the start of February, citing the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigrants, he imposed by executive order 25% tariffs on many Canadian and Mexican goods and 10% tariffs on Chinese ones. China retaliated with tariffs of the same amount, showing a readiness for reprisals that threatened a trade war. Mainstream economy watchers couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that any modern nation might want such a thing. When Trump announced a 30-day pause on Canadian and Mexican tariffs, it was natural to assume he was looking for a face-saving way to climb down from a mistake. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to say that I really enjoy reading the hard copy. So I'm going to read from the hard copy bit. Look at this. Look at this. Look at these ads. Wonderful ads you get. They're not annoying either. All right. So I'm on page 17 still. Face-saving way to climb down for mistake. He was not. Christopher Caldwell continues. At the start of March, back came the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Canada retaliated. Man, Canada retaliated. Mexico threatened to. Trump pulled back on automobile tariffs, but bumped up the Chinese tariff by 10%. All right, so continuing on page 17. I had to get some water. Got some water. Hydration. So he was not. At the start of March, back came the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Canada retaliated. Mexico threatened to. Trump pulled back on automobile tariffs, but bumped up the Chinese tariff by 10 points. On April 2nd, which he billed as Liberation Day, Trump announced 10% tariffs on all imports, along with a special reciprocal tariffs that varied from country to country. The total tariff came to 34% for China, which announced it would tariff U.S. goods at the same rate. Within a week, Trump had, so this is the theme here. The theme is reciprocal tariff wars, okay? The total tariff came to 34% for China. Remember, this is spring 2025, and this issue here, which announced it would tariff U.S. goods at the same rate. Within a week, Trump had changed the Chinese tariff to 125%. Now we're flipping the page to page 18 in the print. So topped off with the remaining fentanyl tariff, fentanyl tariff, of 20%. For a total of 145%. China raised its tariffs on American goods to 125%, stopped buying Boeing planes, and blocked the export of certain components crucial to American manufacturing. The situation had turned into what journalists were calling a bilateral embargo. That spooked Trump officials. By mid-April, the S&P 500 had fallen 20% below its 2025 peak. The market for U.S. debt was softening too, with 10-year borrowing rates climbing 2/3 of a point in just 3 days. Although stocks showed signs of recovery in the weeks that followed, business experts described the alarming ways that not just American shoppers, but also American manufacturers were dependent on Chinese goods. Here, a factory that cannot obtain its compressors anywhere else. There, a workshop that uses magnets made of rare earths on which China has cornered the market. Far from reviving American industry, these experts warned tariffs could endanger it with apocalyptic consequences by summer if trade routes were not reopened. On April 22nd, Trump's visibly uneasy Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent described the situation as unsustainable. The White House sought to open channels with China. The countries met in Geneva on May 12th and agreed to dismantle the punitive tariffs for 3 months, reducing rates to 30% for the US on China and 10% for China on the US. The rates were high by standards of recent history, but survivable. The tariff crisis was over for the time being. Pretty sober for Christopher Caldwell's piece here. Let's continue. We're doing a fair use transformative reading of Christopher Caldwell's Let's Not Do That Again, Claremont Review of Books, Spring 2025. Starting at page 17, we're on page 18 of the print edition. The subtitle, President Trump's trade war could have ended badly. I'd like to thank Claremont Review of Books for making this material available. We'd like to thank Christopher Caldwell for writing it. Go to ClaremontReviewBooks.com and subscribe today. Trump's point. Throughout the spring, the closer businessmen and bankers were to the center of negotiations, the more they knew about the workings of macroeconomics and international trade, the better they knew Donald Trump, the more uneasy they tended to be. The stakes are high. The United States is trying to pull off a feat that, since the Byzantine Empire, no world power has really managed. To use its understanding of history's cycles and short-circuit the inevitable seeming process of imperial decline. Wow. The great appeal and great effrontery. I have to look at my print edition to look and see if I have any comments. Okay. The great appeal and great effrontery of Trump's plan is that it is built on age-old common sense. Like most people, I have that underlined, common sense. Like most people educated before the turn of the century, he believes it's a bad sign when a country runs a trade deficit. The United States imports more stuff from elsewhere than foreigners import from America. In the old days, when currencies were worth a certain amount in gold, large trade deficits were a warning sign. Either your country would run down its stock of gold, or you would have to devalue your currency to keep it all from flowing out the door. Pay attention to this next paragraph here. See if I can highlight it for you. But we don't live in that world anymore. Most contemporary economists insist. In a world of fiat currencies, floating exchange rates, and financial engineering, trade deficits can even be a sign of something good. They are, among other things, a measure of the premium that the possessor of the reserve currency can demand from trade partners, not to mention lenders. It's a tribute. Enjoy it. You deserve it. That might have been true of the 1990 economy, but it sounds less believable now. The world has come spectacularly out of balance. The U.S. is everyone's best customer, but all but, all but one of the world's largest countries has a trade surplus with us. The exception is Britain, the ne plus ultra of deindustrialization and financialization, where 100,000 people invest the money of the world's oligarchy, while 30 million people pour cappuccinos for them. Certain small economies, Mexico, Vietnam, Ireland, have huge trade surpluses with us too. Worldwide, the American trade deficit now runs into the trillions, 1.2 trillion in 2024. By far the largest in history of the planet, and far too much to be paid for by skimming a bit of seigniorage. So we borrow. Although a country's trade deficit is not the same thing as its budget deficit, the two can run in tandem. Ours do. Our government debt now stands at 36 trillion. China, China, by contrast, is the world's factory. It has trade surpluses with everybody. It is developing the cutting edge technologies that not only will power tomorrow's economy, but also can be converted to military production or other emergency uses. The Chinese and American roles are perfectly complementary, but one is the role of a rising country, the other of a declining one. However, much institutional economists and mainstream columnists may extol American leadership in the global economy and condemn Trump's abdication from it. No other country wants the job. When China and the United States were at loggerheads in mid-April, China naturally found itself under selling pressure. Selling pressure. Europeans could have obtained lots of toys, tech components, and appliances at bargain rates. Did it leap at the chance? Au contraire. European Union policymakers were panicked that the EU might drift into the role the US seems to be abandoning. They met for urgent discussions about how to keep China from dumping its goods on the old continent. Wow. This is pretty bracing, man. Jeez. I'm going to switch to the paper copy now. Man. I got to make sure I say all my notes here, because I like to have a cigar when I read this. Yeah. I can get distracted by what YouTube recommends, because like when I'm reading this, YouTube is constantly popping out of the page and saying, I recommend War and Peace. I recommend Pride and Prejudice. I recommend Wuthering Heights. Just kidding. It's just paper, man. That's why I like it. There's no distractions except for what's in my own soul. Over the past few years, Europe has grown nervous about China. The 27-nation trading bloc, in which Germany is the dominant economy and German automobiles, Mercedes, BMW, and Volkswagen, the dominant industry, it has come under the sway of the futurologists who run the World Economic Forum in Davos and the child prophet Greta Thunberg. Starting around the time of the finance crisis of 2008, that's 2008 years after Jesus, by the way. That's where we're counting from. Jesus is the center of history, Jesus Christ, the Lord Jesus, the Son of God. Just thought I would throw that in there. The EU began billing itself as the world leader in the fight against global warming, pledging zero carbon emissions by 2050, and that 2050 after Jesus, who's called the Christ, the Son of God, the Lord Jesus. Just FYI, center of history. Just thought I would throw that in there. In other words, it committed to sabotaging its own world-leading system for manufacturing fuel-powered cars, burners, as Germany's press calls them, and replacing them with electric ones it does not yet know how to build. Wow. Aside from Tesla, in fact, only China is building affordable e-vehicles at scale, and Tesla itself makes half its cars in Shanghai, in its Shanghai Gigafactory. In many branches of clean energy technology, China has taken what promises to be, as long as the global economy remains open, an insurmountable lead, even if the energy used in its green tech comes disproportionately from dirty fuels like coal. The largest polluter on the planet, China has designed, developed, and learned to mass produce not just solar panels and heat pumps, but also electric cars that perform almost up to the standards of European burners. That's a nice little dig. I like that. And at a fraction of the price. Yikes. That's scary. Between 2020 and 2023, they rose from 4% to 25% of the European market, at which point Europe placed massive Trump-sized tariffs on them, starting at 18% for China-built Teslas and rising to 45% for some Chinese brands. The EU's plan, thus far unsuccessful, is to shelter European automakers from Chinese competition long enough to let them convert their production to electric. The Biden administration pursued a similar strategy in its own 2022 Green Energy Bill, mislabeled the Inflation Reduction Act, using subsidies to ecological startups in place of tariffs. The Trump philosophy is somewhat different. It is that if the United States is going to be a loser in the so-called green transition, then there ain't going to be no green transition. And I actually have LOL here, and I still laugh. I didn't even look at that. I laughed. My notes are so on point. I can't tell you how many times I start to make a note, and then I realize I already said 6 months ago the exact thing I was thinking about writing. I'm going to read that last sentence again. The Trump philosophy is somewhat different. It is that if the United States is going to be a loser in the so-called green transition, then there ain't going to be no green transition. Page 19 at the top. American class war on a global stage. Trump is not pursuing a global trade policy so much as waging a domestic class war. The former is fallout from the latter. That's the popular part of his program. The United States drew tremendous benefits from globalization in the decades after the Cold War, but those who divvied them up were a minority. Trump changed that in the first 3 years of his first term. Until COVID hit, per capita economic growth was lower than it had been under Barack Obama, but the growth was better shared. Those years brought the first sustained downward redistribution of income since the 20th century, with wages for workers in the lowest quarter rising at a rate of 5%. Perhaps this was due to the tightness of immigration policy. Whether or not tariffs can have a similar effect, the attempt to use them for redistributing American economic power has a long history. Until a century ago, when the 16th Amendment allowed Woodrow Wilson to introduce an income tax, Democrat, Tariffs were the main economic issue in American politics, with high points in the nullification crisis that was brewing when Alexis de Tocqueville visited America in the 1830s, and in arguments over bimetallism that marked the 1890s. The difference is that back then it was regions and industries that clashed. New York manufacturing, both its barons and its workers, wanted protection, while South Carolina cotton, both its gentlemen farmers and its sharecroppers, wanted free trade. Today, the clashes are more straightforwardly class-based. The haves of the global economy face off against the have-nots. Let's go ahead and go back to the screen here. Find out where we're at so you can see that part. There, that's the part we just left off. We just left off right here. Class conflict helps shore up what might otherwise have been a rickety presidential base. Trump is relying on the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to address a number of intractable problems related to the international economy. Though immigration and fentanyl are emergencies of a sort, that act does not permit the president to seize Congress's Article 1 powers and draw up an entire schedule of non-emergency tariffs. Okay, let's take a look. Let's take a close look at this paragraph here. Page 19 of the print edition, starting class conflicts. Class conflicts help shore up what might otherwise have been a rickety presidential base. Trump is relying on a 1977 International Emergency Powers Act to address a number of intractable problems related to the international economy. Though immigration and fentanyl are emergencies of a sort, that act does not permit the president to seize Congress's Article 1 powers and draw up an entire schedule of non-emergency tariffs. Now, what do you notice about this sentence right here? Does anybody want to guess? It agrees with what the Supreme Court said yesterday. Today is 21 February 2026, Saturday. Yesterday, Friday, 20 February 2026, in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court said exactly what Chris Caldwell just said. Now, there was a Republican dispute about that. Kavanaugh was writing in dissent. Kavanaugh, a Trump-appointed judge. So there is a Republican dispute about that. I just wanted to point it out to you. A number of pre-Trump judicial luminaries, led by prominent conservative Mitch McConnell, have made that case powerfully in a judicial brief. Trump can apply the word reciprocal to tariffs that diverge widely from those which foreign countries impose, but that misnomer will not bring them into conformity with the New Deal era Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, under which Congress delegated to the president powers to negotiate but not pass tariffs. Okay. All right. That is where class conflict comes in. If Trump is out on a constitutional limb, most Americans don't care. The demographer David Shor, the Democratic Party's strategic wunderkind during the Obama administration, has lately been on a mission to explain to older party strategists why talking about Donald Trump's damage to institutions doesn't help them. What brought Trump to power, he warns, is widespread discontent with the status quo. Shore recently asked voters, what's more important right now? Preserving America's institutions or delivering change that improves people's lives? They chose the change over institutions by 78% to 18%. Wow. Procedural problems won't doom Trump. Voters weren't particularly wowed by the probity of the Biden administration either, and that gives Trump a degree of insulation from the corruption allegations that would naturally arise from, say, his accepting a $500 million jet as a gift from the government of Qatar. Uh, but economic anxiety is a different story. Yes. Trump has gotten into trouble by not being clear about what he intends his tariffs to accomplish. There you go, right there. There's a guy on National Review's Capitol Record named David Bonson's been saying this quite a bit over the last year. Traditionally, tariffs, which again are just a tax on imports, have three uses. One, they can be a source of revenue, up to $2 billion a day, the president hopes. Two, they can be a means to strengthen domestic industries by protecting them from competition of foreign ones. And three, the prospect of a tariff can be used to coerce foreign countries into changing their policies. Right? Am I right or am I right? Or am I right or am I right or am I right? Sounds right to me. We're in a different page now. I'm going to the print edition here. We're on page 20. Okay. So a nice summary of those three uses of tariffs. Very good. And here's my note about David Bonson. See, wow, I'm right on cue here. Nice. Good job. Good job, David Bonson, for putting your stuff on YouTube now and not taking it down, because the Apple podcast thing where you're constantly taking it down was driving me nuts. If these goals, excuse me, these goals are often mutually contradictory. If you seek too much tax revenue, goal one, you can give domestic businesses too much protection so that they become slack and inefficient, undermining goal two. Once you introduce a tariff to pursue goal one or two, you can no longer use it as leverage to pursue goal three. And so on. In Trump's tariff oratory, these trade-offs are seldom apparent. The closest thing to an overarching strategy was laid out in a 40-page paper that Trump's chief economic advisor, Stephen Miron, wrote before he joined the administration. It linked trade policy to macroeconomic policy. Miron believes reserve currency status makes the dollar too strong. U.S. exports become too expensive for their traditional markets. But new avenues of influence arise for bankers and politicians. That's scary. The result is the ineluctable financialization or hollowing out of the economy. Miron envisions using the threat of tariffs to force China and other countries with which the United States has deficits to durably revalue. I think I want to fix that splint infinitive. To revalue durably their currencies against the dollar. This is essentially what was done in the 1985 Plaza Accord. Japan, then seen as the systematic threat to American economic dominance, was prevailed upon to accept a rising yen that would boost domestic consumption and ease the pressure on American industry. No country would do that today. The results for Japan were catastrophic. Rising purchasing power brought a real estate bubble so extreme at one point. The land underneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was worth more than all the real estate in California. Jeez. Starting in the 1990s, Japan suffered a real estate crash and went into a deflation from which it has struggled to emerge, despite massive deficit spending. Trump is correct that the United States is such a desirable customer that any dominant export power, Japan a generation ago, China now, must accommodate it one way or another. But it can be dangerous to be too accommodating. And countries that export a lot to the United States have now had a lot of time to consider how they will respond to its demands. We're continuing with Christopher Caldwell in Claremont Review-of-Books, Spring 2025, his excellent piece called Let's Not Do That Again about the Trump tariffs. We're on page 20. Go to ClaremontReviewBooks.com and subscribe today. The complications of disentanglement. China was ready for these tariffs. It's not just that Trump had sprung 25% duties on a number of products in the mid-2018. It is also that after the Cold War, the United States acquired the habit of sanctioning countries of which it disapproved, frequently using for that purpose the very same 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act Trump believed he could use to reorder global trade. Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush used the act sparingly, but the Clinton administration was enamored of sanctions in all their forms, reckoning that cutting off food and energy to countries that fall short of American progressive ideals is a branch of peaceful diplomacy. What began as a targeted way of pressuring Serbia over its crackdown on Kosovo in 1998, or blocking the export of blood diamonds from Sierra Leone in 2001, has now crept into general, non-geographic spheres of policy making. Once George W. Bush had used the IEEPA against, quote, terror, unquote, and Barack Obama used it against cybercrime. The prospect of a president using it to pursue migration policy and drug enforcement did not look so far-fetched. Don't you love this context that Christopher Caldwell provides? I do. I think he's a wonderful writer. He's one of my favorite writers on American politics. We're going through his book discussing the age of entitlement, America since the 60s, Simon & Schuster 2020. You want to check out those episodes as well. It's a wonderful discussion we're having of that book. It's a very important political phenomenology. Very, very important. Very important. Well, we're going to continue, page 20 here. Trump came to power on a wave of opinion that favors decoupling from China. This opinion has been built not just on sentiment, but also on the newest thinking in trade economics by MIT's David Autor and others. But decoupling is more easily said than done. It is not just a matter of bringing factories home. China, as we have said, would be in a position to inflict real hardship on the United States if it chose. As Trump's demands escalated, China signaled that it might so choose. And since the last Sino-American spat over tariffs in 2018, the United States' leverage over China has been diminishing. Look at the COVID epidemic, the COVID. Although the U.S. health authorities were convinced that lives depended on the ability to mass-produce masks, U.S. industry and government never managed to get factories up and running. In the old days, this was not a project that would have required coordination from Washington or Silicon Valley. The homegrown brains and brawn you could find in Chicopee, Massachusetts, Utica, New York, or Dayton, Ohio would have sufficed. Yet America was dependent on iffy Chinese imports till the end of the epidemic. Jeez. After the, by the way, you want to like meditate on this. You know, just like let this sink in. In the old days, look at the COVID epidemic. Although U.S. health authorities were convinced that lives depended on the ability to mass produce masks, I love how he writes that. U.S. industry and government never managed to get factories up and running. Look at that. Look at that progress. We're so progressive, aren't we? In the old days, back in my day, this was not a project that would have required coordination from Washington or Silicon Valley. The homegrown brains and brawn you could find in Chicopee, Massachusetts, Utica, New York, or Dayton, Ohio, would have sufficed. Yet, in progressive America, was dependent on iffy Chinese imports till the end of the epidemic. Just let that sink in. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, sleepy Joe Biden, I inserted the word sleepy, Joe Biden got another lesson in American decline. He attempted to bring the Russian economy to its knees with sanctions and boycotts, only to discover that the United States and Europe, even together, lacked the leverage to compel China and India to join them. Backward Russia has manufactured more shells in the course of the war than the advanced West. And now Donald Trump has discovered that China will not accept a trade war lying down. I'm hoping that this is sinking in and that you're interested in what it's saying and what it portends. We have one more page left in this excellent book review. It's actually not really a book review, it's an essay. Claremont Review-of-Books, Spring 2025 Years After Jesus, titled Let's Not Do That Again. We're on page 21. The American position is delicate because the United States still bears a double responsibility. It is not just a republic, but also an empire of sorts. By the way, that word empire is used in the Federalist Papers. Look at the first Federalist Papers. One that sets the rules for the global economy. Political polarization complicates both responsibilities. Republicans are the party of the republic, Democrats of the empire. And the election of Trump is a sign that a lot of Americans believe our rules-based international order to be a high-class scam. I think you need to see that for yourself. So I'm going to shine it on the screen and we'll take a look at it. Republicans. The American position is delicate because the United States still bears a double responsibility. It's not just a republic, but also an empire of sorts, one that sets the rules for the global economy. Political polarization complicates both responsibilities. Democrats are the party of the republic. Sorry. Republicans are the party of the republic. Democrats of the empire. And the election of Trump is a sign that a lot of Americans believe our rule-based international order to be a high-class scam. It's a very interesting set of statements there. To people who believe this, the most commonly advanced criticism of Trump's trade policy, that he risks wrecking the architecture of the global economy, is hardly a criticism at all. Wrecking that architecture is not a blunder, it's a campaign promise. I think that's worth reflecting on there. What about that? In a trade war, republic and empire find themselves at cross purposes. The republic is unreliable. Really standing up to China would inevitably bring a deterioration in living standards over the short and medium term. It would thus require bipartisan solidarity and unity of national purpose, the prospect of which is so distant that its very mention will elicit a grim chuckle. And the empire is restless. Much as the world outside of Western Europe has rooted for Vladimir Putin throughout America's proxy war against Russia, the world, with fewer exceptions, has been rooting for Xi Jinping, and Xi Jinping. I don't know the tones. I should probably look that up. Xi Jinping and his disagreements with Donald Trump escalated into a trade war. Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping. It is hard to say where the advantage lay. On one hand, Trump was right that the United States was less entangled with the global economy than China was, more capable of enduring a period of autoc autarky, autarky, hmm, autarky. I love that word. I'm going to use that word more often. On the other hand, that is true only on paper. In a trade war, economic statistics are less important than a leader's ability to limit domestic dissent. And if that is right, then the United States is poorly prepared for the battle it has chosen. Steady as Xi goes, Xi is XI, that is Xi Jinping, the leader of communist China. Steady as Xi goes, Xi Jinping. The 90-day pause declared in Geneva on May 12th caught observers by surprise. When the dust cleared on several nerve-wracking weeks during which Trump had undergone almost non-stop criticism, our protectionist president seemed to be in a winning position with a new regime of light tariffs, 10%, on most countries and somewhat heavier ones, nominally 39%, on China. China. Forecasters downgraded the likelihood of recession. Markets stood roughly where they had been before the new measures. China would start exporting those compressors and rare earths again. Most Americans were content with that. Trump's polls floated back up toward their late January highs. That this might be a victory for Trump was naturally hard to acknowledge for journalists who had covered the ominous developments across the global economy with an ever rising schadenfreude. China called Trump's bluff, wrote The Atlantic. China called Trump's bluff, wrote The Atlantic. Playing a game of chicken over the economy, Trump is the first one to swerve, the New York Times headlined. And ascending almost to self-parody, the Wall Street Journal editorialized, The president started a trade war with Adam Smith. He lost. Journalists were so dug in against Trump that they attacked him for his rather sensible misgivings about consumerism, materialism, and filling our houses with junk. Quote, well, maybe the children will have $2 dolls instead of 30, will have $2 instead of $30, the president, quote unquote, the president had mused in late April. Quote, and maybe the $2 will cost a couple bucks more, unquote. How dare he? To the journal's evident relief, no sooner was the trade truce announced than two China-based artificial Christmas tree factories announced they were considering the 30% tariffs a level with which they can work. Wow. The idea that he had cowed China into submission was important to Trump. China was being hurt very badly, he said, but the victory was qualified. Trump had avoided outright economic panic only by acting against the whole logic of his trade war, exempting iPhones from his tariffs once credible reports emerged that they might drive the cost of this middle class desideratum as high as $3,500. There were pundits who attributed the steadiness of markets to the taco trade, not an allusion to Mexican commercial practices, but an acronym for Trump always chickens out. High though the remaining China tariff appears, more than half of it is accounted for by the punitive fentanyl tariff of 20%. In the aftermath of the Geneva negotiations, Treasury Secretary Besant admits the upside surprise for me from this weekend was the level of Chinese engagement on the fentanyl crisis. That shouldn't be surprising. China is not some Mexican crime family alongside its export machine. The economic impact of fentanyl precursor chemicals is minuscule, and one can expect China to go to any length to dispel American worries. That is why, at the height of the conflict in April, China kept its tariff at 125% rather than letting them rise to the American level of 145%. They wanted to preserve the idea of reciprocity and the sense that the real tariff for a China cleared of fentanyl suspicions would be 20% lower than wherever the negotiations ended up. Should China cooperate, the United States will face a choice. It can either hypocritically persist with its punitive fentanyl tariff in defiance of the evidence, or it can eliminate them, in which case our baseline tariff for China will be roughly what it is for the rest of the world. That is not much to show. This is a key point right here, and I think it's worth shining on the screen here. Go back to this shining it on the screen. Um, that is not much to show. Yeah, that's a fair point. That is not much to show for an assault on the underpinnings of the $90 trillion global economy. Hmm. Yeah. I suspect there's other stuff that can't be said here that's operating in the background, but the political point stands because voters have to know and understand this stuff if they're going to continue to support Republicans. It is worrisome that Donald Trump has grown so dependent on crowing about his victories. For a man whose deepest conviction is that every human being is open to a deal, he pays strikingly little attention to other countries' sense of honor, which is generally the value that statesmen are least willing to barter away. It is not Trump's fault that Americans find themselves in a position where their future economic comfort is at least partly in the hands of Xi Jinping. But Americans are fortunate that that is Xi Jinping. I don't know the tones. I'm sorry. I'll look it up. I'll look it up later. Americans are fortunate that I think she is high tone. I'm pretty sure. Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping. I think that's how you say it. I think it's ping as in low tone. Ping. Xi Jinping. Okay. But Americans are fortunate that she, Americans are fortunate that she had, sounds like she is an SHE, but it's XI. Americans are fortunate that she had the ability, the inclination, and the social standing in his own political culture to accompany the United States back from the brink. Had we been dealing with a more democratic adversary, one provided by the media, with the same incentives American leaders have to whip up the passions and resentments of the public, the outcome could have been calamitously different. Christopher Caldwell is a contributing editor of Claremont Review of Books. We'd like to thank Claremont Review of Books for making this material available. We'd like to thank Christopher Caldwell for writing it. Go to ClaremontReviewofBooks.com today and sign up, subscribe, throw some money their way, support your local excellent publisher, support your local book dealer. Today has been a somber day on the Republican Professor podcast, dealing with this dispute within Republican politics and its impact on so many people in the economy, business people, consumers, so on and so forth, the electorate, whether they're able to understand what's going on. And that's a necessary condition of having sympathy for what's going on. We got our work cut out for us, as always. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Saturday, 21 February 2026, years after Jesus. Like I said, it's a Saturday. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time.